I used to think I knew exactly who I was. 19 years of careful self-construction, a personality built brick by brick, each one labeled with neat identifiers: straight, analytical, reserved, practical. The kind of guy who color-coded his class notes and knew exactly which med school he wanted to attend since sophomore year of high school. Then came that night in November, and suddenly those bricks scattered across the floor of our shared apartment, leaving me standing in the wreckage of my former certainty. It's strange how you can share space with someone for months and still feel like you're orbiting different planets. Eli moved in 3 weeks before fall semester started. He answered my desperately posted Craigslist ad seeking a roommate after my high school friend bailed last minute. When he showed up at the door, backpack slung over one shoulder, dark curls falling across his forehead, I remember thinking he looked like someone who belonged in New York or LA, not our mid-sized Midwestern college town where personality usually came second to practicality. "You must be Noah," he'd said, extending a hand that was adorned with a thin silver ring on his middle finger. His grip was firm, confident. "Thanks for not being a serial killer. At least, I'm assuming you're not." The corner of his mouth had lifted in a half-smile that seemed both friendly and somehow distant, like he was already calculating how much of himself to reveal. I'd laughed awkwardly, suddenly aware of my wrinkled Target t-shirt and the fact that I hadn't bothered to style my hair that morning. We settled into a rhythm quickly. Eli was a grad student in the film studies department, 2 years older and light years more sophisticated than me. He moved through life with an easy confidence I both envied and found slightly irritating. While I agonized over which electives would look best on my med school applications, he stayed up until 3 a.m. editing footage on his laptop, drinking black coffee, and occasionally emerging to make brief, cryptic observations about whatever I was watching on Netflix. "You know, the real tragedy of Breaking Bad is that it's actually a love story disguised as a crime drama," he'd say, leaning against the doorframe, eyes slightly red-rimmed from staring at his computer screen too long. Then he'd disappear back into his room before I could formulate a response that didn't sound painfully obvious or naive. That was Eli, dropping philosophical bombs and then retreating before the dust could settle. I found myself thinking about his comments long after he'd gone, turning them over in my mind like stones in a pocket. There was something both frustrating and fascinating about the way he saw the world, always finding the hidden narrative, the story beneath the story. My pre-med brain, trained to look for concrete answers and clear diagnoses, struggled to follow his metaphorical leaps but was intrigued nonetheless. We existed like this for nearly 2 months, parallel lines occasionally crossing for brief moments of connection before veering back to our separate trajectories. He had his film school friends who wore all black and quoted directors I'd never heard of. I had my study group from organic chemistry who lived on energy drinks and shared mnemonic devices for memorizing amino acid structures. On paper, we had no reason to become anything more than cordial cohabitants sharing a 2-bedroom apartment with questionable water pressure. Then came that Thursday night in early November. I remember because I just bombed my immunology midterm, the first test I'd ever scored below a B+ on. My carefully maintained GPA, the one I'd been nurturing like a fragile plant since freshman year, was suddenly in jeopardy. I'd come home, tossed my backpack onto the couch with uncharacteristic carelessness, and announced to our empty living room that I was going to get spectacularly drunk for the first time since the high school. Eli had emerged from his room, headphones around his neck, eyebrows raised in amused surprise. "The golden boy is going rogue? This I have to see." He'd grabbed his keys from the hook by the door. "Come on, if you're going to have an existential crisis, at least do it somewhere with decent music." I'd followed him without argument, grateful not to be alone with my shattered academic self-image and secretly pleased that he wanted to witness my rare moment of rebellion. The bar he took me to was not the usual college dive with sticky floors and top 40 blasting. It was a small place tucked between a record store and a vintage clothing shop, with exposed brick walls and Edison bulbs hanging in copper fixtures. The crowd was older, mostly grad students and young professionals in their late 20s. No one was doing shots or playing beer pong. Instead, people sat in intimate groups, engaged in conversations that required leaning in close to hear over the indie rock playing at a volume that encouraged talking rather than shouting. "First round's on me," Eli said, guiding me to 2 empty stools at the bar with a light touch between my shoulder blades. "What's your poison?" I panicked briefly, realizing my alcohol knowledge extended only to whatever cheap beer was on special at frat parties. Surprise me, I said, trying to sound nonchalant. He smiled. Not his usual half-smile, but something warmer, more genuine. Brave choice. I like it. He ordered us 2 whiskeys, neat, and clinked his glass against mine. To academic failure, the first step toward becoming an interesting person. The liquor burned down my throat, but I managed not to cough. By the third drink, a pleasant warmth had spread through my limbs, and I found myself telling Eli things I rarely articulated even to myself. My fear that I was pursuing medicine to please my surgeon father, rather than out of genuine passion. The panic attacks I sometimes had before exams but told everyone were just stomach bugs. So why do it? He asked, dark eyes focused intently on mine. We'd moved from the bar to a small table in the corner, chairs positioned at an angle that made our knees occasionally brush against each other. Why not switch to something that actually lights you up? The question was so simple yet so destabilizing. No one had ever suggested that I could simply choose another path. In my family, the Gardner legacy of medicine stretched back 3 generations. Deviation wasn't discussed. What lights you up, Noah? Eli asked again when I didn't respond. The way he said my name made it sound like a different word entirely, something with more dimensions than I'd ever noticed before. I took a large sip of what was now my 4th drink and tried to ignore the way my heartbeat had accelerated. The bar suddenly felt too warm, too close. Eli was looking at me with an intensity that made me feel both seen and exposed, like he was peeling back layers I didn't know I had. Biology, I finally said, then shook my head. No, that's not right. It's the moments in the lab when everything clicks into place, when the microscopic world suddenly makes sense in a way that nothing else does. I surprised myself with the answer, with the thread of genuine passion that ran through it. Eli nodded slowly, a smile spreading across his face. See? There's something real there. Something that's actually yours, not your dad's. The validation in his voice made something tighten in my chest. We stayed until closing time, the conversation flowing more easily with each hour that passed. Eli told me about growing up in a small town in Oregon, about coming out to his religious parents at 16 and the 2 difficult years that followed before he left for college. He described the first time he picked up a camera, an old Nikon his art teacher had given him, and how framing the world through that lens had helped him make sense of his place in it. There was a vulnerability to him I hadn't seen before, a depth beneath the curated coolness he usually projected. The walk home was cold, November air biting at our cheeks, making them flush pink. The alcohol had worn off enough for me to feel self-conscious about how much I'd shared, about the way our conversation had veered into territory far more intimate than roommate small talk. But Eli seemed completely at ease, hands in his pockets, breath forming small clouds in the night air as he pointed out architectural details on buildings I'd passed 100 times without noticing. Thanks, I said as we approached our apartment building. For tonight, I trailed off, not sure how to articulate what I was grateful for without sounding overly earnest. He glanced at me sideways, that half-smile returning. For showing you that failing one test doesn't actually mean your life is over, I laughed, relieved by his lightness. Yeah, that, and for the whiskey education, though I'm pretty sure I'm going to regret that part tomorrow morning. Inside our apartment, the familiar space felt different somehow, charged with a new awareness. I was acutely conscious of Eli moving around the kitchen, filling 2 glasses with water, handing one to me with a casual, "Drink this unless you want to hate yourself tomorrow." Our fingers brushed during the exchange, and I felt a small jolt that I immediately attributed to static electricity or lingering drunkenness or anything other than what it might actually have been. "Night, Noah," he said, disappearing into his room, leaving me standing in our small living room feeling like something significant had shifted, but unable to name exactly what. I drank the water, changed into sleep shorts and a worn Northwestern t-shirt and fell into bed, my mind replaying fragments of our conversation as I drifted toward sleep. The last thing I remember thinking was that Eli had looked at me differently tonight, not as his somewhat uptight pre-med roommate, but as someone worth knowing. I woke to darkness and the disorienting awareness that I wasn't alone. Sleep cleared from my brain in an instant as I registered the weight on the edge of my mattress, the subtle dip that indicated someone was sitting there. My heart hammered against my ribs as I lay perfectly still, eyes adjusting to the dim glow from the streetlight filtering through my blinds. Enough light to make out a familiar silhouette. Eli. In my room. On my bed, at I glanced at the digital clock on my nightstand. 3:24 a.m. Before I could speak, before I could ask what the hell he was doing, I felt it. The lightest touch on my forearm where it rested above the covers. Fingertips barely making contact, tracing an invisible pattern from my wrist to my elbow. So gentle it could have been a dream, except for the very real goosebumps rising on my skin in the wake of that touch. I should have jerked away. I should have sat up and demanded an explanation. Instead, I remained frozen, my breath caught in my throat, my mind racing with confusion and something else I wouldn't name. The touch continued, feather light, moving from my arm to my shoulder, then pausing at the collar of my t-shirt. I felt rather than heard Eli's breathing, slightly uneven, as if he too was caught in some internal struggle. The rational part of my brain screamed that this was wrong, inappropriate, a violation of boundaries. But another part, a part I hadn't known existed until that moment, wanted to lean into that touch, to see where it might lead. The conflict kept me paralyzed, caught between opposing impulses. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the touch withdrew. The mattress shifted as Eli stood, and in the dim light I could see him run a hand through his hair in what looked like frustration or regret. He turned toward the door, and without conscious decision, I spoke. Eli. Just his name, barely above a whisper, but it froze him mid-step. He turned back slowly, and even in the darkness I could feel the weight of his gaze. I thought you were asleep, he said finally, voice rough. I should go, but he didn't move, as if waiting for something. Permission or prohibition, I wasn't sure. My heart was beating so loudly, I was certain he could hear it in the quiet room. Why? I started, then stopped, not knowing how to finish the question. Why were you touching me? Why did you stop? Why am I not more upset about this? The unfinished question hung between us like smoke. I'm sorry, he said, and there was genuine remorse in his voice. I've been fighting this for weeks. I thought I could just ignore it, but tonight at the bar, the way you talked about your passion for biology, the way you really looked at me for the first time, he shook his head. It doesn't matter. I crossed a line. It won't happen again. He turned once more toward the door, and something twisted painfully in my chest at the finality in his voice. Wait, I said, louder this time, pushing myself up to sitting position. The sheet fell to my waist, and I was absurdly conscious of how thin my old t-shirt was, how vulnerable I felt in the half-darkness. I struggled to find the words, to make sense of the chaotic emotions colliding inside me. I've never felt... I couldn't finish the thought, couldn't articulate feelings I barely understood myself. Eli took a step back toward the bed, hope and hesitation warring on his face. Noah? He said my name like a question, and suddenly the distance between us felt unbearable. I reached out, not sure what I was asking for, but knowing I needed something to anchor me in this moment that felt like it might shatter at any second. He took my outstretched hand in his, and the simple contact sent a current through me that made my earlier explanation of static electricity seem laughably inadequate. His thumb traced circles on my palm, and I watched it with fascination, as if it were happening to someone else. I don't know what this is, I admitted, voice barely audible even in the quiet room. I gestured vaguely between us with my free hand. Eli nodded, understanding what I couldn't say. We don't have to define it, he said, sitting down on the edge of the bed again, still holding my hand like it was something precious. We don't have to do anything. We can just be here, right now. The offer of simplicity, of presence without pressure, loosened something tight in my chest. And so we sat in the dark, hands linked, neither of us speaking but communicating volumes in the silence. After what could have been minutes or hours, Eli gently released my hand and stood. It's late. We should both get some sleep. The moment was ending, returning us to the reality of roommates and boundaries and all the complications that awaited in daylight. I felt a surge of panic at the thought of morning, of having to face what had transpired between us with the harsh clarity of sunlight. Eli, I said, as he reached the doorway. He paused, a silhouette against the slightly lighter darkness of the hallway. I'm glad you weren't a serial killer. It was a callback to our first meeting, an attempt at levity to break the intensity of the moment. His quiet laugh sent a wave of relief through me. Me too, Noah. Me too. Then he was gone, leaving me alone with the thoughts that spun like planets knocked from their orbits, gravitating toward a new center. Sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the strange encounter, trying to make sense of my reactions. Why hadn't I been angry or disturbed? Why, instead, had I felt a pull toward Eli that defied all my previous understanding of myself? I thought back to high school, to the girls I'd dated briefly and without much enthusiasm, always assuming my lack of passion was just a sign of maturity, of being focused on goals rather than relationships. Had I been wrong? Had I been missing something fundamental about myself all along? Morning arrived with no answers, just the smell of coffee brewing and the sound of Eli moving around the kitchen. I lay in bed, suddenly terrified of facing him, of seeing regret or worse, pity in his eyes. But hiding would only postpone the inevitable. With a deep breath, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and reached for the hoodie draped over my desk chair. Whatever was happening, whatever last night meant, I would face it head on. The carefully constructed version of myself might be crumbling, but perhaps what remained underneath was something stronger, more honest. I opened my bedroom door and stepped into the hallway, each movement feeling strangely significant, as if I were crossing a threshold that extended far beyond our small apartment. Eli was at the kitchen counter, back to me, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He turned at the sound of my approach, and our eyes met across the living room. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. There was uncertainty in his expression, but also something else, a warmth and openness that made my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't name. "I made coffee," he said finally, lifting one of the mugs and offering. Such an ordinary gesture, yet layered with new meaning. I crossed the room and accepted the mug, our fingers brushing in the exchange. This time, I didn't try to explain away the jolt that traveled up my arm. "Thanks," I said, voice slightly hoarse from lack of sleep. We stood side by side at the counter, sipping our coffee in silence, the morning light casting soft shadows across the familiar space that now felt charged with unspoken possibility. "About last night," Eli began, setting his mug down carefully. I braced myself, uncertain what I wanted him to say. "I meant what I said. We don't have to define this, whatever it is. But I also need you to know that I respect you too much to pretend it didn't happen." He turned to face me directly, eyes serious. "If you want to forget it, we can try. If you want to talk about it, I'm here. No pressure either way." The ball was in my court, a fact that both terrified and empowered me. I stared into my coffee, searching for courage in its dark surface. "I don't want to forget it," I said finally, the words coming out steadier than I expected. "But I don't know what happens next. This isn't—" I gestured vaguely with my free hand. "This isn't something I ever expected to feel." The admission hung in the air between us, raw and honest. Eli nodded slowly, a small smile softening his features. "For what it's worth, neither did I. Not with you, not with my straight roommate who color codes his notes and goes to bed at 10 p.m. The gentle teasing broke the tension, and I found myself laughing despite the weight of the moment. "Hey, a consistent sleep schedule is important for cognitive function. I've read the studies." Eli's smile widened, reaching his eyes in a way that made something warm unfurl in my stomach. "Of course you have." There was fond exasperation in his voice, and suddenly it seemed possible that we could navigate this new territory without losing the easy rapport we'd established. But as the initial moment of lightness passed, reality reasserted itself. "I have class in an hour," I said reluctantly, "and a lab meeting this afternoon." The normal schedule of my life waited, unaware that everything had changed overnight. Eli nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Go, do your pre-med thing. We have time to figure this out." The simple promise of time, of continuation rather than conclusion, eased some of the anxiety coiled in my chest. In the shower, as hot water cascaded over my shoulders, I tried to process the seismic shift that had occurred in my carefully ordered world. One night, one touch, and suddenly, I was questioning aspects of my identity I had never before thought to examine. Was I gay? Bisexual? Or was this something specific to Eli, to the particular chemistry between us? The labels felt simultaneously important and inadequate, unable to capture the complexity of what I was experiencing. I dressed methodically, falling back on routine as an anchor in the storm of uncertainty. Jeans, Northwestern sweatshirt, the same sneakers I'd worn nearly every day this semester. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked unchanged. Same dishwater blonde hair, same blue eyes, same face I'd known for 19 years. Yet I felt profoundly different, as if some essential recalibration had occurred on a cellular level. How strange that such an internal earthquake could leave no visible trace. As I gathered my backpack and laptop, Eli emerged from his room, keys in hand. "I've got a departmental meeting, then I'll be editing in the lab until late," he said, voice casual, as if we were having an ordinary roommate conversation. "Don't wait up." He paused, then added more softly, "But text me if you want to talk, anytime." The offer was simple but weighted with meaning. I nodded, suddenly unable to form words around the lump in my throat. We left the apartment together, an everyday occurrence that now felt charged with new significance. As we reached the sidewalk where our paths diverged, me toward the science buildings on North Campus, him toward the arts quad to the east, Eli hesitated. "Noah," he said, voice low enough that only I could hear it in the morning bustle of students rushing to class. "Whatever happens next, I'm glad you know. I'm glad I don't have to pretend anymore." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing on the corner watching his retreating figure until it disappeared into the flow of students. The day passed in a blur of lectures and lab work, my body going through the motions while my mind repeatedly drifted back to the previous night. During organic chemistry, I found myself staring at the molecular structures projected on the screen, thinking about Eli's fingers tracing patterns on my arm. In the lab, as I carefully measured reagents for an experiment, I wondered what might have happened if I had been bolder, if I had pulled him closer instead of just holding his hand. The thoughts were so distracting that I nearly added the wrong solution to my test tube, catching myself just in time to avoid ruining hours of work. "You okay, man?" Jason, my lab partner, asked as I fumbled with a pipette for the third time. "You seem out of it today." I muttered something about not sleeping well, about the immunology midterm still weighing on me. The lie came easily, but underneath it was a realization. I wasn't ready to share this with anyone else. Whatever was happening between Eli and me existed in a fragile bubble that I feared would burst if exposed to outside scrutiny. By evening, exhaustion and emotional overload had left me drained. I returned to an empty apartment, remembering Eli's words about editing until late. The space felt different without him. Emptier somehow, though I'd spent countless evenings alone here before. I made a half-hearted attempt at studying before abandoning my textbook in favor of lying on the couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying the previous night's events for the 100th time. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother, asking about Thanksgiving plans, whether I'd be coming home or staying on campus to study. The mundane question from my normal life felt surreal against the backdrop of my internal upheaval. How could I sit at the family dinner table, pass the mashed potatoes, and make small talk about med school applications while carrying this seismic secret? The disconnect between my external life and internal reality yawned like a chasm. On impulse, I pulled up Eli's contact and typed out a message. "The apartment feels weird without you here." I hit send before I could overthink it, then immediately regretted the vulnerability. 3 minutes later, my phone buzzed with his reply. "Weird how? Like haunted weird or just quiet weird?" The response was so typically Eli, slightly deflecting, using humor as a buffer, that I found myself smiling despite my anxiety. "Quiet weird," I texted back. "Also, I think I'm having an identity crisis, so there's that." As soon as I sent it, I wished I could take it back. Too honest, too raw for a text message. But Eli's response came quickly. "Identity crises are my specialty. Currently in editing hell, but should be done by midnight. Wait up." The question mark made it an invitation rather than an expectation. 3 letters, but I stared at them for a long time before responding. "Yes." The hours between that exchange and midnight stretched interminably. I showered, changed into clean sweatpants and a t-shirt, then obsessed about whether that looked like I was trying too hard or not hard enough. I attempted to study again, managing to read the same paragraph in my textbook 6 times without absorbing a word. Finally, I gave up and turned on Netflix, selecting a documentary series about deep-sea creatures that required minimal mental engagement. At 11:53 p.m., I heard the key in the lock. My heart rate immediately accelerated, and I straightened up on the couch, suddenly unsure what to do with my hands or where to look. Eli entered, looking tired but smiling when he saw me. "You actually waited up," he said, dropping his backpack by the door and shrugging off his jacket. "I half expected to find you color-coding your sock drawer or something equally relaxing." The teasing was gentle, affectionate rather than mocking. "My socks are organized by thickness, not color," I replied, attempting to match his lightness despite the nervous energy buzzing through me. "Much more practical that way." Eli laughed, the sound warming something in my chest. He moved to the kitchen, opening the refrigerator. "I'm starving. Editing makes me forget to eat." He pulled out leftover pizza from 2 nights ago, not bothering to heat it before taking a bite. "Want some?" The normalcy of the moment, Eli eating cold pizza in our kitchen at midnight, calmed some of the anxiety that had been building all day. This was still Eli, still my roommate with his questionable food habits and easy charm. Whatever else was happening between us hadn't erased the foundation of familiarity we'd established over the past months. I shook my head at the pizza offer but patted the couch beside me in invitation. Eli hesitated for just a moment before joining me, leaving a careful few inches between us. He took another bite of pizza, chewed thoughtfully, then said, "So, identity crisis?" The question was gently probing but not pressuring. I could feel his gaze on me, patient and attentive. The weight of everything I'd been thinking about all day pressed against my chest, and suddenly I wasn't sure where to begin. "I don't know who I am anymore," I finally said, voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I thought I knew about myself feels unstable." I stared at my hands, unable to meet his eyes as I continued. "I've always had this clear picture of my life. Med school, residency, maybe a research position somewhere prestigious. Marriage eventually, kids probably. All very conventional." I swallowed hard. And now I'm sitting here wondering if that was ever really what I wanted, or just what I thought I was supposed to want. Eli was quiet for a moment, considering. "For what it's worth," he finally said, "I don't think anyone really knows who they are at 19. We're all just pretending to have it figured out." He set the pizza aside, turning to face me more directly. "But I get it. This is specifically complicated." The understanding in his voice gave me courage to continue. "Last night," I began, then stopped, searching for words. "When you were touching my arm, I should have been freaked out. I should have pulled away or told you to leave, but instead I struggled to articulate the complex swirl of emotions I'd experienced. "Seen," I finally said, like something that had been buried deep inside me was suddenly exposed to light. And terrified, because what does that mean about everything I thought I knew about myself? Eli reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wanted to, and placed his hand on mine. The simple contact sent a jolt through me, both comforting and electrifying. "It doesn't have to mean anything definitive," he said gently. "Sexuality isn't always a fixed point. Sometimes it's fluid. Sometimes it's specific to a person rather than a gender." His thumb traced small circles on the back of my hand, echoing the touch from the night before. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," Eli continued, his voice low and reassuring in our dimly lit living room. "Sometimes understanding yourself is less about finding definitive labels and more about acknowledging what feels true in the moment." The gentle pressure of his hand on mine anchored me as my thoughts threatened to spiral into panic. I studied our hands, his slightly larger, with those long filmmaker's fingers, mine pale against his olive skin, and tried to make sense of how right this simple touch felt. "But what if I'm just confused?" I whispered, giving voice to the fear that had been circling my mind all day. "What if this is just some weird phase, or I'm just lonely or something?" Even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. This wasn't confusion. It was clarity cutting through years of assumptions I'd never thought to question. Eli's thumb stilled its movement on my hand, and I could feel him considering his response carefully. "Do you want to find out?" he asked finally, the question hanging between us like suspended time. I looked up then, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since he'd sat down. The vulnerability I saw there, it matched my own, and somehow that gave me courage. This wasn't just about me figuring things out. Eli was taking a risk too, opening himself to potential rejection or disappointment. The realization that we were both navigating uncertainty made me feel less alone in the vastness of what I was feeling. "Yes," I said, the single syllable emerging stronger than I expected. "But I don't know how." Eli's lips curved in a small smile, patient and understanding without a trace of condescension. We start slow, he said. We talk. We spend time together. We don't rush anything. His fingers interlaced with mine, a subtle shift that deepened our connection. And if at any point you want to stop, we stop. No questions asked, no hard feelings. The gentleness of the offer made my throat tight with emotion. Okay, I agreed, the word barely audible. Then again, more firmly. Okay. Something settled in me with the decision, a foundation forming beneath the uncertainty. Eli squeezed my hand once, then released it, leaning back slightly. So, Noah Gardner, he said, his tone lightening though his eyes remained intent on mine. Tell me something I don't know about you. Something real. The request caught me off guard. Simple yet profound in its invitation to authenticity. I thought for a moment, searching for something that wasn't just surface-level detail, but a genuine piece of myself. I play the piano, I said finally. Not like recital level or anything, but I love it, Bach especially. The precision of it, the mathematical patterns, but also how emotional it can be. I hadn't touched a keyboard since starting college, hadn't mentioned this part of myself to anyone here. It felt significant somehow, sharing this with Eli. My dad thinks it's a waste of time, something that won't help my med school applications. But when I was in high school, I used to sneak down to the music room during lunch sometimes just to play. Eli's expression softened with genuine interest. I had no idea. You've been hiding a whole artistic side. There was warmth in his voice that made me feel strangely proud of this revelation. Would you play for me sometime? The request was gentle, without pressure, but the thought of sharing that private joy with him made my heart beat faster. I nodded, surprised by how much I wanted him to see that part of me. Yeah, there's an old upright in the music building practice rooms. Maybe sometime next week? It's a date, Eli said, then immediately looked uncertain, as if worried he'd pushed too far. I mean, I surprised both of us by laughing, the tension of the evening briefly breaking. It's okay. Maybe it is a date. I think I'd like that. The words felt foreign yet liberating as they left my mouth. Eli's answering smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds, gradual, warm, illuminating. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the declaration settling between us like a promise. Eventually, Eli yawned, reminding us both of the late hour and the emotional weight of our conversation. I should get some sleep, he said reluctantly. Early class tomorrow. I nodded, suddenly aware of my own exhaustion, the culmination of 2 nights of disrupted sleep and emotional upheaval. We both stood, and there was a moment of awkward choreography as we navigated the new awareness between us. I wanted to reach for him, but wasn't sure how or if I should. Eli solved the dilemma by stepping forward and gently, briefly, touching my cheek with his palm. Just that, a warm hand against my skin for the space of 2 heartbeats, before he stepped back. Good night, Noah, he said softly, then turned toward his bedroom. I stood frozen for a moment after his door closed, my hand rising to touch the spot where his palm had been, the ghost of his warmth lingering on my skin. Good night, I whispered to the empty living room, feeling like I was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, but no longer quite so terrifying. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in days, as if some tightly wound spring inside me had finally relaxed. I woke to sunlight streaming through my blinds and the smell of coffee brewing, our normal morning routine resuming, yet now colored with new meaning. In the kitchen, Eli was making toast, hair still damp from the shower, humming something under his breath. He looked up as I entered, and the smile that spread across his face made my chest tighten with an emotion I was beginning to recognize as affection tinged with desire. Morning, he said, sliding a mug of coffee across the counter toward me, cream, no sugar, just how I liked it. The simple fact that he knew this preference, had integrated it into his morning routine without comment, struck me as unbearably intimate suddenly. Sleep okay? There was genuine concern in the question, a reminder of the significant conversation we'd had just hours before. I nodded, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. Better than I have in a while, actually. The admission felt like another small truth offered between us. Our morning routines overlapped and diverged as usual. Eli heading to his 9 a.m. film theory seminar, me to the biology lab. But now there was a current of awareness underlying our movements around each other. a lingering glance as I reached past him for the cereal, his hand briefly resting on my shoulder as he passed behind me, the way he leaned slightly closer than necessary when checking the time on my watch. Small moments, easily dismissed individually, but collectively forming a new language between us. Before we left the apartment, Eli paused by the door. "Dinner tonight?" he asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice despite our conversation the night before. "I could cook, nothing fancy, but I make a decent pasta." The thought of sharing a meal at our small kitchen table, just the two of us with no pretense of roommate casualness, sent a flutter of nervous anticipation through me. "I'd like that," I said, amazed at how steady my voice sounded when everything inside me felt in flux. Throughout the day, I found myself checking my phone between classes, reading and rereading the simple text Eli had sent. 8 p.m. Don't eat lunch too late. Such an ordinary message, yet it carried the weight of anticipation, of deliberate choice rather than roommate coincidence. In cellular biology, I caught myself staring out the window, watching autumn leaves scuttle across the quad, thinking about Eli's hands kneading pasta dough, about sitting across from him at our table, about what might happen afterward. When I returned to the apartment that evening, the smell of garlic and herbs greeted me at the door. Eli stood at the stove stirring something that sizzled pleasantly, a dish towel tossed over one shoulder. He looked up as I entered, and something about the domesticity of the scene, him cooking in our small kitchen, waiting for me, made my heart contract painfully. "Right on time," he said, gesturing with a wooden spoon. "I was just about to add the pasta. Do you want to open the wine?" There was a bottle of red on the counter, not the cheap stuff we usually bought for parties, but something with an actual cork and a label I didn't recognize. I picked it up, suddenly nervous. "I've never actually opened a bottle of wine before," I admitted, examining the corkscrew beside it with mild trepidation. Eli laughed, but it was warm rather than mocking. "The pre-med student defeated by basic physics? Come here, I'll show you." He set down his spoon and moved behind me, reaching around to place his hands over mine on the bottle and corkscrew. The position brought his chest against my back, his chin nearly resting on my shoulder. I could feel the warmth of him all along my spine, could smell the subtle notes of his shampoo and something else that was uniquely him. His hands guided mine through the motion of inserting the corkscrew and leveraging the cork out with a satisfying pop. "There," he said, his voice close to my ear, sending a shiver down my neck. "Now you'll never be stranded at a fancy doctor party without wine access." Neither of us moved immediately, caught in the intimacy of the moment, my back still pressed to his chest, his arms still loosely circling me. I could feel his heartbeat slightly faster than normal, matching my own accelerated pulse. Finally, Eli stepped back, returning to the stove where the sauce bubbled impatiently. "Glasses are in the cabinet," he said over his shoulder, voice slightly rougher than before. I took a moment to steady myself before retrieving them, wondering if he was as affected by the brief contact as I was. Dinner was both more and less awkward than I had anticipated. The food was excellent, a simple pasta dish elevated by fresh herbs and good olive oil, paired surprisingly well with the wine that Eli poured with a slight flourish. Conversation flowed more easily than I expected, perhaps aided by the wine, or perhaps because beneath the new tension, we were still the same people who had been sharing space for months. Eli told stories about his undergraduate film projects, including a disastrous documentary attempt that ended with him falling into a creek while trying to get the perfect shot. "So there I am," he said, gesturing expressively with his fork, "soaking wet, my camera barely saved, and my subject, this very serious environmental science professor, just staring at me like I'm the most incompetent human being she's ever encountered. And I still had to interview her for another 40 minutes, dripping onto her office carpet the entire time." His self-deprecating humor made me laugh, easing some of the nervous tension that had been building in my chest all day. As we cleared the dishes, working in companionable tandem at the sink, I found myself studying his profile. The straight line of his nose, the curve of his lower lip, the way his dark curls fell across his forehead when he leaned forward. It struck me that I had never really looked at another man this way before, with this specific quality of attention that was both aesthetic and something more visceral. The realization should have been jarring, but instead it felt like recognizing something that had always been true but never acknowledged. Later, we settled on the couch with the remains of the wine, Eli queuing up a film he insisted I needed to see. some French indie movie with deliberately paced scenes and minimal dialogue. Under normal circumstances, it wouldn't have held my interest, but I found myself caught up in the quiet intensity of it, or perhaps in the quiet intensity of sitting beside Eli, increasingly aware of the narrowing distance between us as the movie progressed. By the final scenes, his thigh was pressed against mine, our shoulders touching, neither of us having made a deliberate move, but both having gradually shifted closer. The film ended on an ambiguous note, the screen fading to black before the credits rolled. In the sudden silence, the awareness of his proximity became acute, the warmth of him against my side both comforting and electrically charged. "What did you think?" Eli asked, his voice low in the darkened room, illuminated only by the credits scrolling on the TV screen. I turned my head to answer and found his face much closer than I expected, his eyes searching mine in the dim light. I struggled to form coherent thoughts with him so near, the wine and the lateness of the hour making everything feel slightly dreamlike. "Beautiful," I finally said, meaning both the film and the moment we were currently suspended in. Eli's gaze dropped briefly to my lips, then back to my eyes, a silent question in the look. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized what he was asking. This was the moment, the precipice between what had been and what could be. I could pull back, laugh it off, preserve the status quo, or I could lean in, cross the line we'd been circling for days. The choice seemed monumental, yet in that moment it felt like the simplest decision I'd ever made. I closed the distance between us, pressing my lips to his in a kiss that was tentative at first, a gentle exploration. Eli remained perfectly still for a heartbeat, as if afraid any movement might shatter the moment. Then his hand came up to cup my jaw, angling my face slightly as he responded with equal gentleness. It was nothing like I had imagined a first kiss with another man might be, not aggressive or overwhelming, but tender, almost reverent in its restraint. When we parted, I kept my eyes closed for a moment, processing the flood of sensations, the slight roughness of his 5 o'clock shadow against my skin, the taste of wine on his lips, the surprising softness of the kiss itself. When I finally looked at him, the vulnerability in his expression took my breath away. There was desire there, yes, but also a naked hope that made my chest ache with reciprocal feeling. "Okay?" he asked softly, his thumb tracing a small arc along my jawline. The simple question contained multitudes, checking my boundaries, my feelings, my comfort with what had just happened. I nodded, not trusting my voice immediately. Then finding words, more than okay, I searched for how to express the complexity of what I was feeling. I never knew it could feel like that. The admission was small but profound, a recognition of something awakening in me that had been dormant or denied for too long. Eli's smile was gentle, understanding. "It gets even better," he said, then quickly added, "Not that we have to rush anything, we have time." The reassurance was exactly what I needed, acknowledgement of possibility without pressure. I leaned forward, resting my forehead against his, breathing in the shared air between us. His hands moved to my shoulders, then slid down my arms to take both my hands in his, our fingers interlacing naturally as if they had always been meant to fit together this way. We stayed like that for long moments, not speaking, just existing in the new space we had created between us. Eventually, I pulled back slightly to look at him properly. "I should probably get some sleep," I said reluctantly. "Early lab tomorrow." The reality of our regular lives continued despite this seismic shift, classes and commitments waiting regardless of personal revelations. Eli nodded, bringing one of my hands to his lips and pressing a kiss to my knuckles, a gesture so unexpectedly romantic it made my breath catch. "Good night, Noah," he said, releasing my hands and standing from the couch. There was no expectation in his posture or expression, just a gentle conclusion to the evening. I felt a surge of gratitude for his patience, for the way he seemed to understand intuitively what I needed. As he turned toward his bedroom, I found myself reaching for his wrist, stopping him. "Eli," I said, suddenly not wanting the evening to end, not ready to return to separate spaces. Could we just— I couldn't quite articulate what I was asking for, but Eli seemed to understand nevertheless. "We could just sleep," he offered quietly. "Nothing more. Just not alone." The suggestion was exactly right. Intimacy without pressure, closeness without expectation. I nodded, relief flooding through me at being understood so completely. Your room or mine? He asked, and the simple question felt monumental in its domesticity, in its acknowledgement of a shared future unfolding between us. Mine, I decided, wanting him in my space, wanting to wake up and see him against the backdrop of my familiar room. He followed me down the short hallway, the few steps to my bedroom feeling like a significant journey. Inside, with the door closed behind us, I was suddenly conscious of how personal the space was. Textbooks stacked neatly on the desk, family photos on the bookshelf, the periodic table poster my mother had framed as a graduation gift. Eli looked around, taking it all in with an expression of gentle curiosity. "I've never actually been in here properly," he observed, moving to examine the row of science fiction novels on my shelf. "Only that one night, and it was too dark to see much." The reference to the night that had started all this hung between us, not uncomfortable but significant. I watched him trail his fingers along the book spines, struck by how right he looked in my room, how natural his presence felt in this private space. "I like seeing this side of you," he said, turning back to me with a small smile. "The parts you don't show everyone." The observation pierced something in me, the lifelong habit of compartmentalizing, of showing different facets to different people but never the whole. With Eli, somehow, I wanted integration rather than division. "I want you to see all of me," I said, the words emerging before I had fully formed the thought. "Even the parts I'm still figuring out." The vulnerability of the admission left me feeling raw, exposed, but Eli's expression was worth the risk, open and tender in a way that made my chest ache. "That might be the most intimate thing anyone's ever said to me," he replied softly, crossing the room to stand before me. His hands framed my face, thumbs gently brushing my cheekbones. "Thank you for trusting me with that." Then he was kissing me again, deeper than before but still gentle, still letting me set the pace. I found myself leaning into him, my hands finding his waist, drawing him closer as something unfurled in my chest. Desire, yes, but also a profound sense of rightness, of coming home to a place I hadn't known I was seeking. When we finally separated, both slightly breathless, Eli rested his forehead against mine. "We should actually sleep," he murmured, though his tone suggested reluctance. "Early lab, remember?" The reminder of ordinary life, classes, responsibilities, schedules, somehow made the moment more real rather than less, grounding our connection in the practicalities of shared existence. I nodded, stepping back but keeping hold of his hand, not quite ready to break contact entirely. The logistics of preparing for bed created a new kind of intimacy. Eli borrowing a t-shirt to sleep in, the two of us navigating the bathroom in turns, the quiet domesticity of these ordinary actions now infused with deeper meaning. When we finally slid under the covers, there was a moment of uncertainty, of figuring out how our bodies fit together in this new context. Eli solved it by opening his arms in invitation, letting me decide whether to accept. I moved into the space he created, settling against his side, my head finding the hollow of his shoulder as if designed to rest there. His arm wrapped around me, hand settling warm and secure against my back. The position should have felt strange. I had never slept this close to another person before, had certainly never been held by someone larger than myself, but instead, it felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place, a configuration that had always been possible but never realized until now. "This okay?" Eli whispered into the darkness, his breath stirring my hair. I nodded against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my ear. "Perfect," I murmured, already feeling sleep tugging at the edges of my consciousness, the events of the day catching up with me all at once. As I drifted off, I was aware of Eli pressing a gentle kiss to the top of my head, a gesture so tender it followed me into dreams. I woke before my alarm, disoriented momentarily by the unfamiliar warmth beside me. Sometime during the night, we had shifted positions, Eli on his side facing away from me, my arm draped over his waist, my chest pressed to his back. I froze, suddenly intensely aware of the intimacy of the position, of how my body had sought his even in sleep. Before I could decide whether to pull away, Eli's hand covered mine where it rested against his stomach, his fingers interlacing with mine in sleepy acknowledgement. "Morning," he murmured, voice rough with sleep. He didn't turn, didn't disturb our position, just held my hand more securely against him. The simple acceptance, the easy way he welcomed my closeness without comment or question, made something warm bloom in my chest. I pressed my forehead between his shoulder blades, breathing in the sleep-warm scent of him. "Morning," I replied, surprised by how natural it felt to wake up this way, how quickly intimacy could become familiar. Reality intruded in the form of my alarm, the harsh electronic tone breaking the peaceful cocoon we had created. I reached over to silence it, reluctantly pulling away from Eli's warmth. "I have to get ready," I said, already dreading the separation. "Professional development seminar at 9. Eli rolled onto his back, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his dark curls tousled against my pillow. The sight of him there, in my bed, wearing my shirt, looking so perfectly at home, made my breath catch. "I know," he said, making no move to get up. "But maybe 5 more minutes?" He lifted his arm in invitation, and I found myself sliding back under the covers, curling against his side like it was the most natural thing in the world. 5 minutes became 10 as we lay in comfortable silence, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my shoulder, my hand resting on his chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. It was a moment of perfect contentment, unmarred by the confusion and anxiety that had dominated the past few days. Eventually, responsibility won out over comfort, and I forced myself to get up and prepare for the day. As I gathered my things for class, I was acutely aware of Eli still in my bed, watching me with sleepy affection. "Dinner again tonight?" he asked, stretching in a way that made the borrowed t-shirt right up, exposing a strip of skin above the waistband of his boxers. I found myself staring for a moment before dragging my gaze back to his face, a flush warming my cheeks at being so easily distracted. "Yes," I managed, smiling despite my embarrassment. "But I'm cooking this time. It's only fair." The prospect of another evening together, another step in this unfolding relationship, filled me with anticipation that made the day ahead seem more manageable. Eli's answering smile was warm, intimate in a way that suggested shared secrets. "It's a date," he said, echoing his words from 2 nights before, but this time without uncertainty, a simple statement of fact. As I left for class, I was struck by how drastically my life had changed in just a few days, how the ordered, predictable path I had been following had veered into unexpected territory. Yet rather than feeling lost or anxious about this deviation, I felt strangely liberated, as if I had been traveling with an invisible weight that had suddenly lifted. Walking across campus, I noticed details I usually missed in my focused hurry to get from one class to another. The way autumn light filtered through half-bare trees, the sound of laughter from a group of students sprawled on the grass, the rich scent of coffee from the campus cafe. That evening, as I prepared a simple stir-fry, one of the few meals I had perfected during my first semester living off campus, Eli sat on the counter nearby, telling me about his day, his animation project, the documentary film festival he was helping to organize. The domesticity of the scene struck me suddenly. How easily we had slipped into this new configuration, how natural it felt to exist in shared space with this new awareness between us. "What?" Eli asked, noticing my pause as I stirred vegetables in the sizzling pan. I looked up at him, barefoot in our kitchen, casual in jeans and a faded band t-shirt, watching me with genuine interest, and felt a surge of emotion too complex to name. "Nothing," I said, then reconsidered. "Actually, not nothing. I was just thinking how right this feels, being with you like this." The admission felt vulnerable but important, a truth that needed to be spoken aloud. Eli's expression softened, and he slid down from the counter to stand behind me, arms wrapping around my waist as he rested his chin on my shoulder. "It does feel right," he agreed, his voice low near my ear, like something clicking into place that I didn't even know was missing. The metaphor resonated with my own experience, this sense of finding something I hadn't realized I was searching for. I leaned back slightly into his embrace, allowing myself to fully inhabit the moment. After dinner, as we washed dishes side by side, Eli grew quiet, a slight furrow appearing between his brows that I was beginning to recognize as a sign of internal debate. Finally, as he dried the last plate, he turned to me. "Can we talk about something?" The question had a weight to it that made my stomach tighten with sudden anxiety. "Of course," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I dried my hands on a dish towel. "I was thinking about last night," Eli began, setting the plate down carefully, "about how quickly things are moving between us. My heart sank, preparing for regret or withdrawal, for him to say we needed to slow down or step back. Instead, he continued, and I realized I haven't actually told you how I feel about you. Not properly. He took a deep breath, meeting my eyes directly. I don't want you to think this is casual for me, Noah. It's not. I've been falling for you since that night at the bar when you told me about your passion for biology, maybe even before that. The candid admission stunned me, not because I doubted his feelings, but because hearing them articulated so clearly made everything more real. I've never felt this way about anyone, he continued when I didn't immediately respond. And I know you're still figuring things out, and that's okay, but I wanted you to know where I stand. This means something to me. You mean something to me. The vulnerability in his voice, the openness of his expression, made my throat tighten with emotion. Eli, I finally managed, reaching for his hand. I don't know if I can put into words what I'm feeling yet. Everything is so new and I'm still trying to understand it all. But I do know that when I'm with you, I feel more like myself than I ever have before. It wasn't quite an "I'm falling for you too," but it was the most honest thing I could offer. This recognition that he was helping me discover an authenticity I had never quite achieved on my own. He seemed to understand what I was trying to say, nodding as his fingers tightened around mine. That's enough for now, he said gently. We have time to figure out the rest. The promise of time, of a future unfolding rather than a fleeting moment, settled something in me. This wasn't just exploration or experimentation. It was the beginning of something with depth and potential, something worth nurturing and protecting. Later that night, lying in my bed with Eli's arms around me, I found myself thinking about the different forms of intimacy we had discovered in just a few days. Physical, emotional, intellectual. Each layer adding complexity and richness to what was growing between us. What are you thinking about? Eli murmured, sensing my wakefulness. I considered deflecting but opted for honesty instead. About how many ways there are to know someone, and how I want to know all of you. His arm tightened around me, pulling me closer against his chest. That might take a lifetime, he said softly, the words containing an unspoken question about possibilities neither of us was ready to name, but both could feel taking shape between us. I'd like that, I whispered into the darkness, surprising myself with the certainty behind the admission. Eli pressed a kiss to my temple, and I felt his smile against my skin. A promise, an acknowledgement, a beginning. The weeks that followed unfolded in a blur of discovery, small moments accumulating into a new understanding of myself and of us together. There were challenges, of course. The first time we ran into my study group at a coffee shop, Eli's hand casually resting on my shoulder, I'd frozen momentarily, unprepared for these separate parts of my life to intersect. Later, alone in our apartment, I tried to explain the complicated tangle of feelings, not shame exactly, but fear of being seen differently, of having my identity reduced to a single facet when I was still understanding its dimensions myself. We can go as slow as you need, Eli had said, patient as always, though I could see the hint of hurt in his eyes at my hesitation. But at some point, Noah, you'll have to decide if you're willing to be seen. All of you, not just the parts that fit neatly into other people's expectations. The gentle challenge had stayed with me, a pebble in my thoughts that I turned over repeatedly in the days that followed. I knew he was right. Authenticity required courage, a willingness to inhabit truth even when it invited judgment or misconception. That weekend, I called my mom for our usual Sunday check-in. Listening to her talk about hospital politics and my younger sister's college applications, I felt the weight of unspoken truths between us. Not yet ready for full disclosure, but increasingly uncomfortable with omission, I mentioned Eli by name for the first time. My roommate Eli and I went to a film festival. Eli's been teaching me about French cinema. Small inclusions that felt significant in their deliberateness. My mother, always perceptive, had paused at one point. This Eli sounds like he's becoming a good friend, she'd said, a subtle question in her tone. He is, I'd replied, heart pounding but voice steady. He's important to me. Not the whole truth, but a step toward it. A breadcrumb leading to eventual understanding that I would have the courage to offer when the time was right. After the call, I'd found Eli editing footage in his room and told him about the conversation. The pride in his eyes as he pulled me into a hug had confirmed that these small acts of authenticity mattered, that each one strengthened rather than diminished me. There were sweeter discoveries, too. The way Eli's expression softened when I played piano for him in the music building's practice room. His filmmaker's eyes closed as he leaned against the wall, completely absorbed in the Bach prelude that my fingers remembered despite months of neglect. The surprise of jealousy the first time I saw him deep in conversation with an attractive film student at a department mixer, followed by the rush of pleasure when he immediately sought me out afterward, his hand finding mine in an unambiguous claim of connection. Thanksgiving approached with the attendant questions about plans and family. I had automatically assumed I would go home as usual, until Eli mentioned he was staying on campus, his relationship with his parents still too complicated for holiday comfort. The thought of leaving him alone in our apartment for 4 days created an unexpected ache in my chest. That night, lying beside him in what had become our shared bed, I mustered the courage to suggest an alternative. What if I stayed here for Thanksgiving? We could cook dinner together, watch movies, just be? The surprise and hope that had bloomed across his face made my heart constrict. Are you sure? He'd asked, careful as always not to pressure me. Your family won't mind? I'd thought about my parents' expectations, my sister's curiosity about why I wasn't coming home, what explanations I would need to offer. They might not understand yet, I admitted, but I think this is where I'm supposed to be this year. The rightness of the decision settled in me even as I said the words. On Thanksgiving morning, we woke late, sunlight streaming through my bedroom window, painting patterns on the wall. Eli propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at me with an expression so tender it made my breath catch. I'm thankful for this, he said simply, his free hand gesturing between us. For you letting me see you, for the chance to know you. The naked emotion in his voice stripped away any remaining armor I might have been holding around my heart. I love you, I said, the words emerging fully formed, surprising us both with their clarity and certainty. I hadn't planned to say it, hadn't even known I was ready to acknowledge the depth of what I was feeling. But once spoken, I recognized the truth in them immediately. This was love, had been becoming love since that night he'd touched my arm in the darkness and woken something that had been sleeping within me. Eli's eyes widened, a vulnerability in his expression that made him look younger suddenly. I love you too, he replied, voice slightly unsteady. God, Noah, I've wanted to tell you for weeks, but I didn't want to rush you or make you feel pressured. The admission made me reach for him, pulling him down until our foreheads touched, sharing breath in the small space between us. You've never pressured me, I said, needing him to understand this fundamental truth. You've just given me space to find myself, to find us. Later, as we prepared our improvised Thanksgiving dinner in our small kitchen, grocery store rotisserie chicken standing in for turkey, stuffing from a box that Eli insisted on elevating, with fresh herbs, cranberry sauce straight from the can, because some traditions are sacred. I was struck by how completely my life had transformed in less than a month. The path I had been following with such certainty had not disappeared, but had widened, making room for possibilities I had never allowed myself to.